The sun was setting over New York City, painting the skyscrapers with golden hues that made the city look even more imposing. Ethan Robinson observed the landscape through the windows of his office on the top floor of the tallest building in the city. His deep brown eyes, as deep as the desert sands, reflected not only the glow of the horizon, but also a loneliness that all his empire could not fill. At 35, Ethan had built one of the largest business conglomerates in the United States. His fortune was a constant topic of speculation in business magazines, and his name was synonymous with power and success. However, on that particular afternoon, as he signed another billion-dollar contract, he felt an inexplicable emptiness. "Mr. Robinson, your meeting in London is confirmed for next week," announced his assistant Sarah, interrupting his thoughts. "And the board requests your presence to discuss the acquisition of the European hotel chain." Ethan nodded distractedly, his fingers drumming on the black marble desk. "Prepare the jet. We'll leave early tomorrow morning. I want to handle this personally." The trip to London wasn't just another business commitment, it was a temporary escape from the constant pressure his family exerted for him to marry some heiress from a traditional family. Matrimonial alliances were still a reality in his social circle, a tradition he had always observed with critical distance. The next morning, London greeted him with its characteristic fine drizzle. After a series of exhausting meetings, Ethan decided to do something unusual. He dismissed his security guards and went out to walk alone through the streets of Notting Hill. That's when his eyes found a small bookstore, one of those that seem to hold stories beyond the books on their shelves. The doorbell chimed softly as he entered. The aroma of old books and freshly brewed coffee created a welcoming atmosphere, so different from the luxurious environments he was accustomed to. That's when he saw her for the first time. Olivia was organizing some books on a high shelf, focused on her work. Her brown hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and there was something about her simple and dedicated manner that immediately caught Ethan's attention. She turned at the sound of his steps and smiled, a genuine smile that didn't change when their eyes met. "Can I help you?" she asked in English, with a slight accent that Ethan couldn't immediately identify. "Yes, I'm looking for something to read," he replied, surprised at himself, for suddenly feeling at a loss for words. He who conducted billion-dollar negotiations with the utmost ease now found himself disconcerted in front of a simple bookstore employee. Olivia guided him through the shelves, talking about literature with a passion that was impossible not to admire. There was no recognition or deference in her posture that Ethan was accustomed to receiving. She treated him as she would treat any other customer, and that was strangely refreshing. "This is one of my favorites," she said, reaching for a volume of Persian poetry. The translation doesn't do justice to the original, but it's still beautiful. Ethan took the book, his fingers lightly brushing against hers. "You read Persian?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. "No," she laughed softly, "but I have a friend who translates. He always says that each translation is a new interpretation, and that some things can only be truly felt in the original language." The conversation flowed naturally, and before he knew it, Ethan had spent more than an hour in the bookstore. Olivia talked about books, art, and music with an ease that charmed him. There was no pretension in her words, just a genuine love for knowledge and culture. When he finally decided to leave, Ethan had bought not only the book of Persian poetry, but also several others she had recommended. More than that, he had discovered something he didn't expect to find on a rainy afternoon in London. Someone who saw him beyond his fortune and position. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself inventing excuses to return to the bookstore. Each visit revealed new facets of Olivia that intrigued him even more. She had a deep knowledge of literature and art, but also a simplicity and honesty. That contrasted with the artificial world in which he lived. Olivia, in turn, began to eagerly await his visits. There was something different about this elegant man who spent hours talking about books, something beyond the obvious charm and impeccable education. Perhaps it was the way his eyes lit up when she talked about her literary passions, or how he seemed genuinely interested in her opinions. One afternoon, as they shared a coffee in the small reading space of the bookstore, Ethan noticed something peculiar. When he mentioned a recent trip to the Middle East, Olivia seemed momentarily tense. her eyes briefly losing their characteristic sparkle. It was just a moment, but enough to arouse his curiosity. "Have you been to the Middle East?" he asked casually. "No," she answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I've just read a lot about the region. The culture, the history, and it's fascinating." Ethan sensed there was more to that answer, something she wasn't saying, but he decided not to push. After all, everyone has the right to their secrets, and there was something about Olivia's mystery that only increased his fascination with her. As the days passed, Ethan began to postpone his return to New York. Business meetings, once his absolute priority, now seemed mere obstacles between his visits to the small bookstore in Notting Hill. For the first time in his life, the powerful businessman was experiencing something that all his money could never buy. The feeling of being appreciated for who he was, not for what he possessed. However, while this unexpected romance blossomed on the rainy streets of London, shadows from the past began to stir. Somewhere, someone recognized Olivia, and an old story, carefully buried, threatened to surface, ready to shake the foundations of this budding love. The London spring brought not only flowers to the city's parks, but also a subtle change in Ethan Robinson's behavior. His associates noticed how the always focused businessman now smiled more frequently, how his decisions seemed more human than purely strategic. The transformation did not go unnoticed, especially by Sarah, his longtime assistant. "Are you sure you don't want me to reschedule the flight to New York?" she asked for the third time that week. "Mr. Stevenson has been insisting on your presence for dinner with his daughter Amanda." Ethan adjusted his tie distractedly, his thoughts already wandering to the small bookstore in Notting Hill. "It won't be necessary, Sarah. We have important matters to resolve here in London." The important matters had become his standard excuse, but the truth was that every moment away from Olivia seemed wasted. In recent weeks, their encounters at the bookstore had evolved into walks through Kensington Gardens and dinners in small restaurants away from the center. Olivia continued to be an enchanting mystery. She spoke passionately about Russian literature, knew fascinating details about the history of Islamic art, but always deflected questions about her own past. When asked about her family, she responded with vague comments about having grown up in different places. On that particular afternoon, Ethan decided to surprise her. He arrived at the bookstore carrying a carefully wrapped package, a first edition of 1001 Nights. Olivia's eyes sparkled as she opened the gift, her hands gently caressing the old cover. "Ethan, this is something that deserves to be with someone who truly appreciates its value," he completed, observing with satisfaction the genuine joy on her face. However, when Olivia opened the book, an old postcard slipped from between its pages. It was an image of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. For a moment, a shadow passed over her face, so quickly that anyone else would have missed it, but not Ethan. "Do you know the palace?" he asked casually, noticing how her fingers trembled slightly as she held the card. Just from books," Olivia replied, quickly composing herself. "It's a fascinating place, isn't it? So many stories, so many secrets kept by those walls." Ethan nodded, storing this small reaction in the growing collection of mysteries surrounding Olivia. There were moments when she seemed perfectly at ease discussing Middle Eastern politics and customs, only to suddenly retreat, as if afraid of revealing too much knowledge. At night, during dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Chelsea, Olivia seemed especially thoughtful. The red wine in her glass remained untouched, and her eyes often got lost in the view of the Thames through the eye window. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked softly, reaching for her hand across the table. "About how unpredictable life can be," she replied after a moment. "Sometimes we find happiness in the most unexpected places, don't we?" There was a melancholy in her voice that touched something deep in Ethan. "Olivia," he began, carefully choosing his words, "you know you can trust me, don't you? Whatever your past—" "Please," she gently interrupted him, her eyes pleading. "Can we just live in the present? Sometimes the past is better left where it is." Ethan wanted to insist, wanted to say that nothing she could reveal would change his feelings, but there was something in the vulnerability of her gaze that made him hesitate. Instead, he decided to share something about himself. "Did you know? I grew up hating all the wealth that surrounded me," he confessed, surprising himself with the sudden honesty. "I saw how money transformed the people around me into artificial versions of themselves. Every smile seemed calculated. Every kindness had a price." Olivia watched him attentively, her eyes softening with understanding. "And now?" "Now?" He smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "Now I understand that true wealth is in moments like this, in finding someone who sees beyond appearances." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Ethan's cell phone. It was Sarah again with urgent news from New York. Problems with one of the group's largest projects required his immediate attention. As he read the messages, he didn't notice the middle-aged man 2 tables behind, who was observing Olivia with a mixture of surprise and recognition. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself torn between his growing love for Olivia and the responsibilities he couldn't ignore. Video calls with New York became more frequent and tense. His father, the patriarch of the Robinson family, was beginning to question his prolonged stay in London. "Son," said Mr. Robinson during one of the calls, "I understand that business in Europe is important, but there are matters here that require your presence. The Stevenson family expects an answer about the proposal of union with their daughter." Ethan felt his heart tighten. How could he explain to his traditional father that he had found true love in a simple bookstore employee in London, a woman about whose past he knew nothing, but whose present filled his heart in a way that no family arrangement ever could? Meanwhile, Olivia was facing her own internal conflicts. Every moment with Ethan made her wish she could tell him the whole truth. But how to explain a story that she herself had tried so hard to forget? How to risk losing the only person who made her feel truly free? One afternoon, while organizing books in the bookstore's basement, Olivia found an old Middle Eastern magazine. On the cover, a photo of a young debutante in a sumptuous palace. Her hands trembled as she recognized the face she had been trying to forget for so long. Quickly, she tucked the magazine into the bottom of a drawer, but the past, like a persistent shadow, was beginning to catch up with her. In the penthouse of the Dorchester Hotel, Ethan spent hours contemplating an engagement ring he had bought on an impulse. The jewel, a stunning diamond surrounded by sapphires, seemed to capture all the light in the room. But would it be enough to build a future on foundations of secrets? Fate, however, had its own plans. That same night, an email arrived in Ethan's inbox. The sender was anonymous, but the content made his blood run cold. It was an old photo apparently taken at a social event in the Middle East, and there, in the center of the image, was a young woman who looked extraordinarily like Olivia, but using a completely different name. Ethan remained motionless in front of the computer screen, his eyes fixed on the photograph he had just received. The image, apparently taken a few years ago at a social event in Abu Dhabi, showed a young woman wearing an elegant gala dress. Her features were unmistakable, the same expressive eyes, the same soft smile, but the name in the caption was different. Princess Amira Al-Sayed, during a celebration at the royal palace. His hands trembled slightly as he zoomed in on the image, studying every detail. The resemblance was too striking to be a coincidence. The woman in the photo carried the same natural grace as Olivia, though wrapped in an aura of royalty that contrasted drastically with the simplicity of the bookstore employee who had won his heart. The sound of the phone yanked him from his thoughts. It was Sarah again. "Mr. Robinson, forgive the interruption, but I've just received information that you need to know." Her voice sounded hesitant. "Apparently, there are rumors circulating in New York about your involvement with a woman in London." Ethan closed his eyes, massaging his temples. "And since when is my personal life a subject for rumors, Sarah?" "Sir, it's not just that. Some people are asking questions about her. Important people." Ethan's heart raced. First the mysterious photo, now this. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was investigating Olivia, and he needed to find out why. That same afternoon, upon entering the bookstore, Ethan immediately noticed that something was different. Olivia looked pale, her hands restless as she organized a pile of books. When she saw him, her usual smile appeared, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Did something happen?" he asked, approaching the counter. "No, nothing," she answered quickly. Too quickly. Just a busy morning. Ethan watched as she moved around the bookstore, noticing how her movements seemed tenser than normal. There was a new fragility in her behavior, as if she were constantly looking over her shoulder. "Olivia," he began, deciding to address the issue directly. "We need to talk." She stopped what she was doing, her back still turned to him. "About what?" "About you. About who you really are." The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia slowly turned around, and Ethan saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Fear. "Please," she whispered. "Not here." They agreed to meet later at a small cafe near the River Thames. The place was practically empty at that time of night, offering the privacy that the conversation required. Olivia arrived wrapped in a dark coat, looking even more fragile under the soft light of the lamps. She sat across from Ethan, her hands intertwined on the table as if seeking strength. "Before you say anything," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need you to know that my feelings for you are real. Everything we shared, every moment, every conversation, it was genuine." Ethan reached for her hands, holding them gently. "I know. And that's why I need to understand. Who is Amira Al-Sayed?" Olivia paled at hearing the name, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment it seemed she would get up and run away. But then something changed in her expression. It was as if an invisible weight had been removed from her shoulders. "It was me," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "In another life, another time, a life that didn't belong to me." The words began to flow like a dammed river that finally finds its way. Olivia, or Amira, told about her childhood in a golden palace where every step was controlled, every decision made by others. She spoke about the crushing expectations, the weight of being the heiress to one of the most powerful families in the Gulf. "I had everything money could buy," she continued, "but I didn't have the freedom to choose my own path, not even the right to love who I wanted." Ethan listened attentively, his heart tightening with each word. He knew this world well, the pressures, the expectations. But Olivia had done something he had never had the courage to do. She had chosen her own freedom. "When they announced my engagement to someone I barely knew, a political agreement disguised as marriage, I realized I couldn't continue," she explained. "It wasn't just about the marriage. It was about having the right to live my own life, to make my own choices." "So you ran away," Ethan concluded softly. Olivia nodded. "With the help of some loyal people, I created a new identity. I started a new life away from all that. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, I felt free." Silence fell over them as Ethan absorbed everything. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts. As a businessman, he understood the weight of family traditions and expectations. As a man, his heart ached thinking about what she had gone through. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he finally asked. "Because every person who knows the truth represents a risk," she answered, her eyes meeting his. "And because I was afraid. Afraid of losing this thing we built. Afraid that you would see me differently." Karim leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Helena, or Amira, you're the same person I fell in love with. The woman who talks about literature with passion, who laughs at my bad jokes, who sees beyond my fortune. Your past doesn't change who you are." Tears now flowed freely down her face. "But it changes everything, Karim. My family, they'll never forgive me. And if they find out where I am, then we'll face it together," he declared firmly. "You're not alone anymore." At that moment, a waiter approached to take their orders, briefly breaking the intensity of the moment. When he walked away, Helena seemed calmer, though still vulnerable. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, her voice gaining an urgency. "Someone recognized me recently, an old family acquaintance who frequents London. That's why I was so nervous today. I'm sure he's going to tell my father." Karim felt his heart tighten. He knew what this meant. In his world, traditional families didn't easily accept challenges to their authority. The situation was more complex than he had imagined. "What do you want to do?" he asked softly. Helena looked out the cafe window, watching the city lights reflected in the Thames. "I've built a life here, Karim, a simple life, but mine. I don't want to run again. I don't want to spend the rest of my days looking over my shoulder." "Then we won't run," he responded with determination. "We'll face this. Together." As they talked, planning their next steps, they didn't notice the man sitting a few tables behind, discreetly photographing them with his cell phone. Within minutes, the images were already traveling through fiber optic cables, crossing continents, until they reached a sumptuous office in Abu Dhabi. Sheikh Hassan Al Sayed, Amira's father, observed the photos on his tablet with an unreadable expression. After years of searching for his daughter, he had finally found her. And not only that, she was with Karim al-Rashid, one of the most powerful men in the Gulf. The sheikh picked up his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. "We've found her," he said simply. "In London, and she's not alone." The day dawned grey, in London, as if the sky itself reflected the tension in the air. In the penthouse of the Dorchester Hotel, Karim watched the city through the panoramic windows, his phone ringing incessantly. News traveled fast in the business world, and even faster in Gulf social circles. "Son," his father's voice sounded grave on the other end of the line, "we need to talk about your recent associations in London." Karim took a deep breath. "Father." "I can explain." "Explain?" Sheikh Fahad interrupted him. "Explain how the heir to the Al-Rashid Empire is getting involved with the runaway daughter of the Al-Sayeds. Do you have any idea of the implications of this?" "Father, it's more complex than it seems. Helena, Amira, she's not what everyone thinks." A heavy silence followed on the other end of the line. When his father spoke again, his voice was laden with concern. "Karim, you've always been sensible in business. Don't let emotions cloud your judgment now. The Al-Sayeds are not people to be trifled with." Meanwhile, in the small bookstore in Notting Hill, Helena tried to maintain the normalcy of her routine, even knowing that her life was about to change drastically. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the newly arrived books, each ring of the doorbell making her heart jump. Mrs. Bennet, the elderly owner of the bookstore, noticed her unease. "Dear, you look pale. Is everything all right?" Helena forced a smile. "Yes, I just didn't sleep very well." The lady observed her with kind and experienced eyes. "You know, in all these years, I never asked about your past. It wasn't my place. But I always knew there was more to you than met the eye. Whatever you're facing, remember, sometimes books aren't our only refuge." The kind words of the lady almost broke Helena's composure. How many people had shown such selfless kindness in her life? Mrs. Bennet had taken her in without asking questions, offering not just a job but a true home. Early in the afternoon, Karim appeared at the bookstore. His usually serene face showed signs of concern. "We need to talk," he said softly, "in private." Mrs. Bennet, sensing the seriousness of the situation, offered her office at the back of the store. "Take all the time you need," she said, discreetly closing the door behind her. "My father knows," Karim began without preamble, "and apparently so does yours." Helena felt the blood freeze in her veins. "How?" "The photos from the cafe. Someone was watching us." Karim moved closer, taking her hands in his. "But I didn't come here to scare you. I came to tell you that no matter what happens, I'm by your side." The tears Helena had been holding back began to fall. "You don't understand, Karim. My father, he's not like yours. He doesn't accept challenges to his authority. To him, what I did wasn't just an escape, it was a betrayal of the family, of tradition." "Then we'll face this together," Karim responded, firmly. "I have resources, influence, I can protect you." Helena shook her head sadly. "It's not that simple. In our world, some things are more important than money or influence. Honor, tradition, pride." At that moment, Helena's cell phone vibrated with a message. Her face paled as she read the text. "It's from my old nanny," she whispered. "My father is on his way to London." Karim hugged her protectively. "Then we have to act fast. I'll arrange additional security. Find a safe place." "No," Helena interrupted, gently pulling away. "I can't let you get more involved in this. I've already caused enough trouble." "Trouble?" Karim held her face between his hands. You showed me what true love is. How can someone look into another person's eyes and see their soul? You taught me that. I won't let you face this alone. Outside the bookstore, London life went on as usual. Tourists took photos, executives rushed to meetings, couples strolled, hand in hand. No one noticed the drama unfolding inside that small establishment. Mrs. Bennet returned with a tray of tea, her face showing maternal concern. I brought some chamomile tea. It helps calm the nerves. Helena smiled gratefully, touched by the lady's kindness. How to explain that her past was about to catch up with her? How to say goodbye to this simple and meaningful life she had built? Mrs. Bennet, she began, her voice choked, I need to tell you something. The lady raised her hand, gently interrupting her. Dear, we all have a past. What matters is who we choose to be in the present. Meanwhile, on a private jet crossing the sky towards London, Sheikh Hassan al-Sayed looked at an old photo of his daughter. In it, a young Amira smiled radiantly during her debutante party. That had been the last time he had seen her truly happy, before the weight of traditions and expectations began to oppress her. Your Excellency, his assistant called, we've just received confirmation. She's still at the bookstore with the young Al-Rashid. The Sheikh nodded silently. His eyes didn't leave the photograph of his daughter. How should a man who had dedicated his life to maintaining traditions deal with a daughter who chose to break them all? How should a father who always wanted the best for his only heiress react upon discovering that she had found happiness precisely in fleeing everything he had planned for her? Back at the bookstore, Karim was making frantic calls, mobilizing his contacts. Helena watched the street movement through the window, wondering how many other people lived double lives, carrying secrets too heavy to share. I've secured a safe place, Karim finally announced. A discreet property on the outskirts of the city. We can go there today. Helena turned to face him, her eyes showing renewed determination. No, Karim, no more running. If my father wants to find me, let him. But this time, it will be on my terms. The courage in her voice made Karim's heart swell with pride and concern simultaneously. He knew the next few days would be decisive, not just for their relationship, but for the future of both families. On the horizon, dark clouds gathered over London, heralding a storm. Inside the bookstore, two souls in love prepared to face their own tempests, clinging to the hope that their love would be strong enough to withstand the forces that would try to tear them apart. The new cultural center in Dubai gleamed under the evening lights, its modern architecture blending perfectly with traditional Arab elements. It was just one day before the grand event that would officially present Helena and Karim to Gulf society, and the final preparations were underway. Helena walked through the spaces of the center, personally supervising every detail. The walls of the main gallery displayed a fascinating exhibition, black and white photographs of pioneering Arab women in their fields, their stories of courage and determination told on bilingual plaques. This exhibition is your most brilliant idea, commented Layla, who had become an invaluable ally in the preparations, showing that your story is part of a larger tradition of women who dared to be different. Finding these stories was revealing, Helena replied, stopping in front of the photograph of a poet from the 1950s. Each of them faced their own challenges, but also found ways to honor their roots. In another space of the center, a team worked on setting up the area dedicated to literature. Elegant shelves displayed a careful selection of works representing the best of Eastern and Western cultures. A special corner had been reserved for a replica of the Notting Hill bookstore, complete with comfortable armchairs and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Mrs. Bennet would love to see this, Helena smiled, adjusting a copy of Jane Eyre on the shelf. And she will, said Karim, appearing behind her. I just received confirmation. She arrives early tomorrow on the first flight. Helena turned, surprised and moved. You managed to convince her to come. Actually, it was your father's idea, Karim revealed. He said that anyone who has been family to you during these years deserves to be part of this moment. The news filled Helena's heart with joy. It was further proof of how her father was genuinely trying to understand and accept her journey. However, not everything was rosy. During a final meeting with the security team, Samira brought worrying news. Some more conservative members of society are restless, she explained, consulting her tablet, especially the Al-Thani family. Apparently they see this event as an affront to traditions. The Al-Thanis, Helena questioned, exchanging a worried look with Karim. It was the same family with whom her marriage had been arranged years ago. Don't worry, Layla reassured, who, being the wife of an Al-Thani, had privileged information. My husband is talking to them. Some people just need time to accept changes. At night, during an intimate dinner at the Al-Sayed mansion, Sheikh Hassan noticed the concern on his daughter's face. Something troubles you, Habibti? He asked gently. Helena hesitated before answering. I'm thinking about how everything has changed so quickly. A few weeks ago, I was just Helena, the bookstore employee. Now you are both, her father completed. And that's what makes you special. You didn't abandon one identity to assume another. You found a way to be true to all parts of who you are. His words touched Helena deeply. It was true, she was no longer running from her past nor trying to deny it. She was creating something new, a bridge between worlds that seemed impossible to connect. Later, in her chambers, Helena leafed through her mother's diary again. One passage in particular caught her attention. True tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. May you find your own way to keep that flame alive, my daughter. A soft sound on the balcony made her look up. It was Fatima bringing her favorite mint tea. I remember your mother writing in that diary, said the housekeeper affectionately. She would spend hours here on this balcony, watching you play in the garden and writing her thoughts. What was she like, Fatima? I mean, really like? The lady sat down beside Helena, her eyes shining with memories. She was like you, gentle but strong. Traditional but progressive in her own way. She knew changes were necessary, but also understood the importance of preserving what is valuable in our culture. The next day, the morning brought renewed bustle. Mrs. Bennet arrived early, marveling at the grandeur of Dubai, and moved to see the replica of her bookstore in the cultural center. It's like a dream, she said, hugging Helena. Seeing how you've transformed your story into something so meaningful. The final preparations were a whirlwind of activities. The space was decorated with an elegant mix of modern and traditional elements, Moroccan lanterns projecting delicate patterns on white walls, antique Persian carpets contrasting with contemporary furniture, the aroma of oud incense mixing with that of fresh coffee. In the late afternoon, during a moment of calm before the storm, Helena found Karim on the balcony of the cultural center, watching the sunset over Dubai. Nervous? He asked, wrapping her in his arms. A little, she admitted. But it's a different nervousness than what I felt when I ran away. This time I'm not running from something, I'm running towards something. And that something is? Helena smiled, watching the city lights begin to shine. A future where we don't have to choose between who we are and who we want to be. Where tradition and progress can dance together, like those lights from the old city blending with the skyscrapers. At that moment, Samira appeared with urgent news. The expression on her face made Helena's heart tighten. The Al-Thanis, she said, her voice tense. They're demanding a private audience with Helena before tomorrow's event. The private salon of the Burj Al Arab Hotel, with its spectacular view of the Persian Gulf, had been chosen for the meeting with the Al-Thanis. Helena adjusted her petrol blue silk hijab, a color that had always given her confidence, as she waited for the arrival of the family that, years ago, had almost defined her destiny. Layla Al-Thani, who had insisted on being present as a mediator, discreetly held her hand. "Remember," she whispered, "you're no longer that frightened young girl. You're a woman who chose her own path and proved she was right." The doors of the salon opened, and Sheikh Abdullah Al-Thani entered, accompanied by his eldest son Khalil, the man Helena was supposed to have married. Time had left subtle marks on both, but the aura of power and authority remained unchanged. "Mashallah," said Sheikh Abdullah, his deep voice filling the room. "The prodigal daughter has truly returned." Helena stood up, maintaining the upright and dignified posture her mother had always taught her. "Sheikh Abdullah, Khalil, thank you for agreeing to meet me." The patriarch of the Althanis made a dismissive gesture with his hand. How could we refuse? Your return and recent choices have been the main topic in all social circles. Khalil, who until then had remained silent, stepped forward. His eyes studied Helena with a curiosity that surprised her. There was no anger there, only genuine interest. You know, he began, for years I wondered what was so terrible about me that made you prefer to disappear rather than marry me. The honesty in his voice caught Helena off guard. It wasn't you, Khalil, she responded softly. It was what our marriage represented, a life where neither of us would have a choice. And now you've chosen the son of the Al-Rashids, Sheikh Abdullah intervened, a touch of irony in his voice. No, Helena corrected firmly. I chose the man I fell in love with. The fact that he's an Al-Rashid is secondary. A heavy silence fell over the salon. Layla watched the scene attentively, ready to intervene if necessary, but it was Khalil who broke the silence, surprising everyone. Did you know I got married too? He said, a small smile appearing on his lips. To a university. Professor, my father nearly had a heart attack when I announced my decision. Sheikh Abdullah let out a sound that could have been a contained laugh. What can I say? Your escape, Amira, or Helena, as you prefer to be called, caused more changes than you imagine. It made many of us question traditions we followed blindly. Helena felt tears forming in her eyes but held them back. So, you didn't come to demand retraction, or try to stop tomorrow's event? We came, the Sheikh responded, to understand, and perhaps to make peace with the past. It was then that Khalil revealed the true reason for their presence. We wanted your permission to participate in tomorrow's event, not as antagonists, but as witnesses to a change that, in a way, we all helped create. Helena's heart overflowed with an emotion she couldn't name. It was as if the last knot of her past was finally unraveling, not through abrupt cuts, but through a gentle and natural dissolution. You will be most welcome, she replied, her voice choked with emotion. When the meeting ended, Helena found Ethan anxiously waiting in the hotel lobby. Seeing her radiant smile, he let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So, he asked, taking her hands in his. So sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places, she replied, sharing what had happened. Back at the cultural center, the final preparations for the next day's event were in full swing. Mrs. Baker, who had spent the day exploring the replica of the bookstore, was ecstatic about the possibilities she saw. Imagine, she said excitedly, we could have a cultural exchange program through books, young Arab and Western writers sharing their stories. Sophie smiled, hugging the woman who had become her second mother. And that will be just the first of many bridges we'll build. That evening, during a family dinner at the Carter mansion, Sophie shared the day's events with her father. Mr. Carter listened attentively, a gleam of pride in his eyes. You see, sweetheart, he said softly, sometimes what seems like rebellion, in the eyes of the world, is actually an act of courage that paves the way for necessary changes. Later, alone on her balcony, Sophie read her mother's diary once again. A new passage caught her attention. True strength lies not in resisting, change or rejecting it completely, but in knowing how to guide it with wisdom and grace. The sound of soft music drifted from the garden, where preparations for a small family celebration were underway. It was a preview of the grand event the following day, more intimate, more personal. Ethan found her there, lost in thought. What are you thinking about? About how strange it is, she replied, leaning back into his embrace. I spent so much time fearing my past, and now it has transformed into a source of strength. Every person I met today, the Thompsons, Mrs. Baker, my father, each represents a different part of my journey. And tomorrow, he said softly, they will all come together to celebrate not just our love, but something bigger, the possibility of change, of evolution, of finding harmony between different worlds. In the garden below, the voices of their loved ones mingled, Arabic and English, laughter and conversations, traditional and modern. It was a preview of the future they were building together. Sophie's phone vibrated with a message. A photo, sent by Layla, showed the main hall of the cultural center fully decorated for the event. Under the soft lights, the mixture of cultural elements created a magical atmosphere, as if two worlds really could coexist in perfect harmony. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Ethan asked. Sophie smiled, her heart overflowing with hope and determination. "I'm ready for everything, not because I know exactly what will happen, but because I finally understood that every part of my story brought me here. And here is exactly where I should be." The sun was rising over New York, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. At the cultural center, the first rays of morning danced through the colored stained glass windows, creating kaleidoscopic patterns on the marble floor. Sophie watched the light spectacle through the window of her preparation room, her heart filled with a peace she had never imagined possible. "You're even more beautiful than your mother on her wedding day," said Maria, adjusting the final details of Sophie's dress, a stunning creation that blended Western and Eastern elements. The traditional white fabric was adorned with delicate embroidery in shades of blue and gold, telling in its patterns the story of two worlds coming together. Mrs. Bennet, who was observing everything with teary eyes, approached with something in her hands. "Something blue," she smiled, showing a delicate vintage brooch in the shape of a book. "It belonged to my grandmother. She was also a woman who dared to be different in her time." The brooch found its perfect place next to Sophie's heart, complementing the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. Every detail of her appearance carried a special meaning, a bridge between past and present, between East and West. In the Great Hall of the Cultural Center, guests began to arrive. The photo exhibition attracted admiring glances, especially the new addition, a photo of Sophie's mother in her youth, smiling as she read to children in a social project she had created. Ethan, impeccable in his modern traditional attire, supervised the final details alongside his father. Mr. Wilson observed with approval how his son had transformed a simple social event into a celebration of change and cultural union. "You know," Mr. Wilson said to his son, "when I was your age, I thought our role was to preserve traditions exactly as we received them. Now I understand that true tradition is like a tree. It needs strong roots, but it also needs to grow and adapt." The Thompsons arrived early, and to the surprise of many, James brought his university professor wife, a woman of vivid intelligence and her own opinions. Together they represented another story of how true love could transcend social expectations. In the center's garden, specially decorated for the occasion, a harmonious blend of aromas filled the air. Traditional American coffee mingled with the scent of English roses, brought especially from London. The music also told its own story of union. Traditional Southern musicians played together with a Western string quartet, creating melodies that seemed to have existed forever, just waiting to be discovered. When the time for the ceremony arrived, the main hall was filled not only with members of high society, but also with people who represented the true essence of Sophie's journey, from the bookstore employees in London to young American writers and artists who saw in that union a symbol of hope and change. Mr. Roberts led his daughter down the central aisle, his heart overflowing with pride. It wasn't just the pride of a father walking his daughter down the aisle, but that of a man who had learned that sometimes you need to let go to truly find. The officiant, a respected scholar known for his progressive thinking, conducted a ceremony that honored both Christian traditions and universal values of love and mutual respect. In an especially touching moment, Sophie and Ethan exchanged vows they had written personally, words that spoke not only of their love for each other, but of their commitment to building bridges between cultures. "Our love," Sophie said, her voice clear and emotional, "is not just about the two of us. It's about showing the world that it's possible to honor our roots while embracing the new. That tradition and progress can dance together, just as our hearts dance to the same rhythm." Ethan, holding his bride's hands, responded with equally profound words. "With you, I learned that true love doesn't ask us to be less than we are, but inspires us to be more understanding, more courageous, more true to ourselves and our heritage." The celebration that followed was a festival of colors, flavors, and cultures. In one corner of the room, Mrs. Bennet was chatting animatedly with young American writers about the possibility of literary translations. In another, traditional, businessmen were discovering, surprised, that change and tradition were not necessarily opposites. The most emotional moment, however, came during dinner, when Mr. Roberts stood up to make a surprise announcement. The cultural center, he revealed, would be expanded to include an international network of similar spaces, starting with the transformation of the bookstore in London. "My daughter taught me," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "that preserving our culture doesn't mean isolating it, but sharing it with the world. And by sharing, we also learn and grow." As the night progressed, Sophie and Ethan danced under the stars in the center's garden. The music blended notes of guitar with Western melodies, creating a harmony that seemed to perfectly represent their union. "Look," Ethan whispered, indicating the guests around them. "See how everyone is mingling, talking, laughing, sharing stories? This is how the world should be." Sophie smiled, leaning back against her husband's chest. "This is how it will be," she replied, "one heart at a time, one story at a time." Later, as the celebration was coming to an end, Sophie found a moment to be alone in the replica of the bookstore. Her fingers caressed the spines of the books, each representing a different story, a different world, a different possibility. Her mother's diary was there, now part of the permanent exhibition. Opening it to the last page, Sophie found a blank space, as if waiting to be filled. Taking a pen, she wrote, "Dear Mum, today I fully understood what you always tried to teach me. That true love, whether for a person, a culture, or a dream, doesn't bind us, but gives us wings. And with these wings, we can build bridges between worlds that seem distant, but deep down share the same human heart." Outside, the city continued its eternal dance between tradition and modernity, its skyscrapers reflecting the stars. And somewhere between these two worlds, a new story was beginning. Not just the story of Sophie and Ethan, but the story of how true love can transform not only hearts, but entire cultures. Dear listeners, we hope that Sophie and Ethan's journey has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. This story reminds us that true love has the power to transcend borders, cultures, and traditions. For more equally moving and transformative stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Share with us in the comments, which city are you following us from, and which moment of the story touched your heart the most? Every day we bring new narratives that explore the beauty and complexity of human relationships. Until the next story,